Welcome to Arise with Sally Goodwin. Good morning, everybody. It seems to be beginning very slowly this morning. I'm not sure why. It could be the internet. Okay, am I here? Here I am. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Arise with Sally Goodwin. It is lovely to have you on this morning. Let me get myself positioned once again. Right, here we are. Here we are. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Arise with Sally Goodwin. Yes, okay, so it seems that my internet connection seemed to be a bit of a problem, but hopefully that is sorted out. Good morning, Radiant Renee. Lovely to see you this morning. Morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Yes, so it seems to have a bit of a slow start, but hopefully that will sort itself out as we go through this morning. It will be okay. We should be all right. We ran out of electricity this morning, so never mind load shedding. We actually ran out of electricity. Good morning, heroic Hilda. Good morning, lovely to see you this morning. Yes, so we ran out of electricity this morning, so never mind load shedding. That was just, we are having an issue where we rent with our pay-as-you-go electricity. No fault of the people that we rent from. Apparently, the city of Cape Town have decided that there is a debt owed, a municipal debt, and every time we buy electricity, they deduct this debt from what we buy. So we can only buy 40 units of electricity at a time because they keep deducting enormous chunks of this municipal debt from our electricity amounts. And we rent, so it's not our debt, but our landlord, it's not their debt either, because so they are desperately trying to sort out this issue. But in the interim, we are spending literally, can I just be honest here? We are literally spending thousands of rands on electricity and getting like 40 units every time. And so the enemy is coming against our covenant with God as our provider. Good morning, beautiful Brenda. Good to see you too. The enemy is coming against our covenant with Yahweh as God our provider. He is trying to steal from us financially because we keep on having to pay out these enormous amounts of money for tiny bits of electricity and then running out. Good morning, beautiful Karen. Lovely to see you. On top of that, I have been sick in bed for the last probably 3 days. So the enemy is coming against my covenant with God as Yahweh, my healer. It has been a time, ladies. It has been a time. And I know I'm not alone because I have been getting messages from many people saying that that they are going through like just some stuff. And yeah, so I wasn't 100% sure that I would make it this morning, but I get these beautiful messages from my gorgeous friend Hilda, and she sends me these messages in the morning and she calls on me to arise. And I'm just like, okay, God, I'm going to get up and do this thing. Even though I'm not feeling 100%, but I'm here. So ladies, if you could just really just stand with me in agreement that the enemy will no longer be able to steal, kill, and destroy. that my landlord will be able to sort out with this electricity issue with the city today, that our finances will be restored, what has been stolen will be restored. If you could just stand in agreement with me for that, please. And then just for my health, those of you who know me well know that I struggle with um, some autoimmune stuff, and so my health struggles are always, you know, they're just there below the surface often. But so if you could just stand in agreement with me that my covenant with Jehovah Jireh and Jehovah Nissi and Jehovah Rapha, that they stand, because he is a covenant keeping God and the enemy cannot steal that from me or kill that or destroy that. And yeah, that we stand in that together, and I stand in agreement with all of you that all of that is true for you too. So yes, and that's where we stand this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we are on, it is Wednesday the 10th of May 2023, and it is the 19th of Iyar 5783. Thank you so much, Conrad. It is Wednesday the 10th of May 2023, and it is the 19th of Iyar 5783. And we are on the 34th day of counting the Omer. At nightfall this evening, Wednesday night, nightfall this evening, we will move on to the 35th day of counting the Omer. So we are on the 34th day of counting the Omer. Nightfall this evening, we move on to the 35th day of counting the Omer. And we are 5 days at nightfall this evening. We are 5 days away from when Jesus was resurrected, not when Jesus was resurrected, when Jesus was taken back to be seated with his Father. And we are getting closer and closer to the Feast of Shavuot, or what we call Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit was released on the earth. So we are in a time that is incredibly significant, and it is an incredibly, just a crucial time. It is a significant time every year. But as we are in a significant decade, a decade that God told me as a prophet a couple of years ago, and those of you who know me and have been following me for a while will have heard me say this, that and heard me preach on this, that God said to me a few years ago, he said to me, Sally, this decade is one of the most significant decades that the world has ever seen, apart from the decade or the time that Jesus walked the earth. And when God told me that, I said to him, Lord, that sounds very sacrilegious to say something like that. And God said to me, it's just as well that I'm saying it and not you. So that put me very firmly in my place. And some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that there are about over 1 million people worldwide who have undertaken what they are calling an Isaiah 62 fast. So I have called this morning's live Iyar, Israel, and the early church, because I have promised various people who have reached out to me, because based on some of the teachings that I've released recently, that I will just refresh some of the things that I've said before, based on the new, on the church and the new wineskin, and some of the things that God has spoken to me over the last couple of years of this decade, things that as a church we should be looking at and we should be preparing ourselves for, in terms of the new wineskin, in terms of what God is trying to do within the church space. And we spoke last week about how God is raising up a remnant, because he always brings forth a remnant. And he always, he gives grace period after grace period after grace period for his people, for his church to do his will. And eventually, when he can see that it is going nowhere, then he raises up a remnant who will step forward and step into the will of God and do what he has called them to do. And we can see, if we study the Old Testament and we study the history of Israel, that God has done that with Israel throughout history, that they would go out of his will, they would move away, and then he would raise up a remnant that would steer them back. And so there is something that has been called, I don't know who began it, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that it spans many different churches, many different ministries. So it is not if there are churches or ministries who are involved in this that you do not agree with, that their theology is not something that you agree with, etc., 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 please, if your heart is for Israel and you feel God calling you to be a part of this, do not allow that to be a stumbling block for you, because this spans many different churches, it spans many different ministries. It is not confined to one church, one ministry, or one particular stream, or one particular theological viewpoint. So do not allow that to be a stumbling block. It is called the Isaiah 62 fast, and if you go onto, they have a website, and it's Isaiah62.com or Isaiah62fast.com, something like that, something along those lines. I have coffee this morning, ladies, because my throat and my nose still a bit dodgy. And my cup, because we all know, those who know me, that I love beautiful coffee mugs. So my beautiful coffee mug that was a birthday present from a friend says, a birthday present from a friend last year, yeah, says, love in my heart, coffee in my hand. Love in my heart, coffee in my hand. Anyway, so a fast has been called for Israel, and over 1 million people are fasting and praying for Israel. And this fast has been called from the 7th of May to the 28th of May. Now, yes, it's the 10th of May already. If you are thinking, oh no, I've missed the beginning of it, that doesn't matter. It's a 21-day fast, but you can step in whenever you feel called to. And it's fast and pray. Whatever you feel, if it resonates with you and you want to be a part of it, you step in however, wherever, whenever you feel God has called you to. Whatever you feel God has called you to fast, however you feel he's called you to do it. And it's basically people who have committed to fast and then to pray for Israel an hour a day. So effectively, places like IHOP, the International House of Prayer, have gotten involved, where they have organized that there will be 24-hour prayer for Israel. So there will be people praying for Israel 24 hours a day for 21 days, from the 7th of May to the 28th of May. And it is an Isaiah 62 fast. If you go and you read Isaiah, there is specific verses that they quote from Isaiah that, God, Jesus speaking about the return of Jesus, that he will only come back when certain things have been met within Israel as God's nation, and this is what people are fasting and praying for. And so if your heart is for Israel, if you're one of those people who, follow the things of Israel, who are interested in my Hebrew teachings, in the times and the seasons of God, I find it so interesting that this fast has been called over this month of Iyar, because this month of Iyar being the month associated with the sons of Issachar, the month associated with those who know and understand the times and the seasons of our God, because this fast is being called, and as I say, I'm not sure who it originated with, but I know that the various ministries and churches who are involved in this are not all ministries and churches who are as closely connected with the kind of the Hebrew calendar and the, the things like that, the more the sort of Jewish roots of the church. So a lot of them are probably unknowingly, have decided to do this at this specific time. And I find it so significant that God has stirred his people to fast and pray for Israel over this month of Iyar, when we need to remember that the sons of Issachar specifically were people back then who understood the times and the seasons of God for Israel and what Israel was supposed to be doing during those times and seasons. So was a specific calling for the sons of Issachar back then during the times of Israel. So I find it very significant that God is literally raising up sons of Issachar on the earth at this time to intercede for Israel, even though some of them don't actually realize the significance of the prophetic timing in terms of the Hebrew calendar. I find that incredibly exciting and very, very significant. So if you want to be involved in that, I'll post the link to the website on my page. I'm sure it's like Isaiah62.com or Isaiah62fast.com. It's literally that. But if you want to get involved in that, I honestly would encourage you to do that. They reckon, the people who've organized it, the people who are involved, heavily involved in the organization of it, they reckon that there will be, over the course of this 21 days, there will be something like 100 million people interceding for Israel eventually, because of the ripple effect and because of the, the effect that happens, that it will land up being something like 100 million people interceding for Israel at this time, which is just the most mind-boggling thing. And to think, and if you have any inkling of our God and how intentional he is and how he sets these things in place at specific times for specific times and seasons, then you know that this is a crucial point in the history of Israel for God to have organized a whole lot of Gentiles to rise up and intercede for Israel at such a time as this. So let us take this very seriously, ladies and gentlemen, and let us be praying into this, and let us be really asking God whether this is something that we need to be involved in. If you do not hear that from the Lord, if it does not resonate with you, please move on. Do not feel condemned or anything, but if you do, then, and however God calls you to be involved in it, however it is, but let us play our part in this historical moment, because it is an historical moment because of the global scale with which this is happening. And again, for all of us who struggle sometimes with technology and with the way the enemy uses technology for evil, this is just the way God uses technology, because years ago this would not have been possible because we didn't have the technology to enable us to do this. But now we get to use technology, we get to use social media, we get to use these things to further the kingdom and to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and to pray for Israel, which is what it tells us to do in the scriptures. And for those of you who wonder why we should do this, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but as I say, my nose is a bit iffy still, and I'm hoping that you are all still out there and I haven't lost all of you somewhere along the line, because I'm not seeing any comments or anythings anywhere. So I'm trusting you all still there, that I haven't lost you, that the internet hasn't dropped me completely, and that I'm not speaking into a vacuum or just speaking to myself. I really do hope that you're all still out there. Right, so what I wanted to say going on from that was just to explain something, because when I spoke last week about a remnant, I really felt like there was something on that I wanted to just explain to you, just in terms of having studied the history of the church, in all of its, the history of the church, the good, the bad, and the ugly, should I say, because there was a lot of good. There has been a lot of good. But oh my goodness, has there been a lot of bad. And oh Jesus, my Jesus, has there been a lot of ugly. But what I wanted to explain to you was this. So if you Google the Isaiah 62 fast, you will probably come across a video by, I forget his name now, well-known guy. Some of you will like him, some of you won't, as always with these big ministry guys. I think it's Francis Chan. And he's his ministry is part of this Isaiah 62 fast. If you like him, wonderful. If you don't like him, don't let that stop you from being a part of this, okay? Don't let that be a stumbling block, all right? Anyway, and he was just speaking about, and it really just, because this has been something God has been whispering to me about, he was speaking about how impossible it is that a nation like Israel could be basically wiped out, that completely destroyed, its people assimilated into other cultures, Greek culture, Roman culture, its main capital city razed almost to the ground. Just that it could be nullified to such an extent, and then centuries later, it pops back up and becomes a nation again. Centuries later, not years later, centuries later. And he was speaking about, just how that blew his mind. And I was thinking, yes, I mean, we know this, do we not? I mean, we know this, those of us who stand for Israel and love the Hebrew. This is what we know. And that verse where it says, can a nation be born in a day? That was a prophetic word for Israel, because yes, a nation can be born in a day. That was Israel. That was God restoring the nation of Israel. And now we have this nation that turned 75 this year, but has this lengthy history going back centuries. And that it is impossible. It is, in no other nation has that happened. But the thing is this is what I'm trying to get across to you. So when we talk about the early church, and that is because that's where we're going to, when we look at the new wineskin, what does that look like? What have I preached on that before? And for those of you who have missed those messages, when we look at the new wineskin, and often we talk about going back to the early church, so many churches and so many pastors that I speak to, they like, we need to go back to the Acts church. We need to go back to the way the church was in Acts. But when I have an in-depth conversation with them. Good morning, Arena. I'm so glad that I saw your comment, Arena, because I'm starting to feel like I'm out here all on my own and that no one is paying any attention. Good morning, Arena. You restored my faith in the internet link. But so many pastors and church leaders and they're like, we need to go back to the way the early church was. We need to be the Acts church again, etc., etc., etc. But when we sit together and I drill down into what is it about the early church that you are wanting to return to, is it the selling everything and giving it to the poor? Is it the living in community and, where the rich people sell what they have and provide for the people who have less? Was it the persecution that you are desperate to return to? Was it the having to sort of hide out and not worship in public? What was it about the early church that makes you want to go back? And inevitably, when you drill down to all of that, it is none of those things. It is the power and the signs and the wonders and the miracles that pastors and church leaders and people today want to return to. That's what they're looking for. They don't want the price or the cost or the sacrifice. They want the reward, the power and the glory and the signs and the wonders and the miracles. That's what they're talking about. That's what they're talking about, because if we look quite closely at the persecuted churches in the world, at the persecuted churches in the Middle East, at the persecuted churches in China, for example, you will find that the things that happened in the early church are happening in those churches. Why? Because they are going through the things that the early church went through. They are persecuted. They meet in small groups. They give everything they have to the poor. They are not interested in big buildings with their names on them. They do not have titles. They are not apostle this and prophet that and pastor so-and-so. They don't go by that. They have to meet in quiet. They have to do all of those things. And because the cost is so high, the reward and the favor of God is incredible, and they see what the early church saw in terms of signs and wonders and miracles. But in the church, our more westernized church, we want all of the power and the glory and the signs and the wonders without paying any sort of price for them. We want no price. We want everything that God has got, but we don't want to pay a price. We want our titles, and we want our prosperity gospel, and we want our perfect lives and to be happy and all of those things. And we want power, and we want glory, and we want signs and wonders and miracles. That's not how it worked in the early church. We need to reread Acts and the Gospels and Paul's letters to the church, because we need to be careful about what we ask God for. So what happened? Firstly, let us remember that the early church was made up of initially mainly Jewish believers, who then added Gentiles into their midst. Mainly Jewish believers who added Gentiles into their midst. So the early church was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. Messianic Jews, as we would call them today, and Gentiles in unity, worshiping Jesus. There are not many places where you see that today. So possibly that's somewhere to start. If your heart is genuinely for your church or your community of believers to go back to the way the early church was, then there needs to be some kind of unity between Messianic Jew and Gentile, where you are worshiping Jesus together, because that was the early church. Then we need to remember that they came out of Judaism. So they followed the Hebrew calendar. They followed the festivals. They followed all of those things because that was all they knew. Now again, let me reiterate. We do not go back to being under the law. We are not swapping one form of legalism for another form of legalism. We do not do that. But we need to remember that that was how the early church would have been. Because they came out of Judaism. That was their lifestyle. It was a lifestyle for them. It wasn't simply a religion, it was the way they lived their lives. And the Gentile believers would have just been a part of that. They would have done Shabbat together. They would have celebrated Passover together. You know, that would have all been incorporated. That was the early church. That was where it began. And that is the context when we read Acts, when we read Paul's letters and Peter's letters and James's letters and all of these books in the New Testament. We need to remember the context. We need to remember that those letters were not written to the Western church of today. They were not written to us. We read them with the arrogance of the Western church of today as if they were written to us in our context. They were not. Yes, they are for us, just as much for us as they were for those people then, but we need to remember the context in which and with which they were written. Very different to what we know today. Very different. We need to remember that in the early church, if we read those letters carefully, someone brought a word, someone brought a song, someone brought a prophecy, someone prayed for healing. There was no worship band. Please hear me here. Understand, do not hear what I am not saying. I have nothing against worship bands. I am trying to make a point in terms of what we say we want as a church and what we actually mean we want. In the early church, the word would be brought first, because often it was a letter from Paul, for example. So the church, for example, in Corinthians, so in Corinth, the church would get together in the house of one of those ladies mentioned. They would get together in the house, all of them meet, and there would be a messenger, Phoebe. You've heard of her before, I've mentioned her, you know her. Someone like that. There would be a messenger, and the messenger would come with a letter from Paul. Maybe it was the church in Rome, maybe it was the church in Philippi, whichever. They would come with a letter from Paul, and the letter would be read they would sit, they would eat together, share a meal together, and then someone would read the letter, bring the word. They would read the letter from Paul, whatever Paul had to say. And once there were no more letters from Paul, then whoever had been taught by Paul, like Timothy or Barnabas or whomever had been raised up under the apostles, they would bring a word, a teaching about Jesus, a teaching that had been gleaned from Paul. And worship would be in response to the word. So if the word was encouraging and uplifting, and you guys are doing so well, or this is what Jesus has done in this church or that church or over here or over there, these are the people who have come to Christ, then the worship would be praise. It would be an outpouring to God. That was what worship would be. If the word was chastising, rebuking, calling for repentance, like you guys need to shift and change slightly, you've gone off a little bit, you following these people, there's division, there's gossip, there's this, there's that, then the worship would be repentant. It would be flat on their faces before God, repenting, pouring out their hearts, asking the Holy Spirit to help them to do better. It would be that. They worshipped after the word in response to the word, because the word then was generally God breathed. It was God coming to them in a situation, and they worshipped him in response to what he was saying. It was a completely different way. And then there would be someone bringing a prophecy, someone praying for someone for healing, someone. That was how it was done. Now, I'm not saying, okay, so this is the formula, let's go back to that, because at the end of the day, just shifting the format in the way we do church is not shifting the way we do church. Because that's often what we do in church, is we think, okay, well, we'll just change our format. That's not the point here. That's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that when we stand before God and we say, God, we want what the early church had, we need to know what we're asking for. We need to know why we want that. And we need to know, we need to be prepared to pay the price for that. To count the cost for that. To bear the sacrifice for that. So that was the church. That was the way the church operated. And then there was persecution, there was all sorts of things. And then came Constantine. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. People disagree on Constantine, whether he genuinely had an experience with the Lord, whether he really had this revelation. Scholars disagree, theologians disagree. I like to trust that he did actually experience God and he was saved. But there definitely was a political motive to what he did. Because what he wanted to do was he wanted to assimilate his kingdom. And he wanted to make, and this is not, I'm not making this up, okay? So this isn't revelation. This is history. You can go and research this, okay? So you can go and study church history and you can figure this all out for yourself. The Jewish people had been, you know, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of these different nations and cultures had ruled over the Jewish people. And the Jewish people had been assimilated into many different cultures. But somehow or other, the Jewish people never lost their own culture. Yes, under the Greeks, they almost lost Hebrew. They almost lost their Hebrew language under the Greeks. They nearly lost it. The Greek, but now we have an Israel where Hebrew is spoken. It might not be ancient Hebrew, but the Greeks don't speak ancient Greek. So that's just linguistics. What I'm saying is this. If you go through history. I love history. At school, history was my favorite subject. I wanted to go to university and study history. Couldn't. But when I started to study theology and I had the opportunity to study church history, it was like all my Christmases had come at once. And when I actually could put church history into like history that I've learned like over years, you know, I was just like, oh my goodness, amazing, just loved it. So what in ancient times, what a nation would do when it took another nation, which is why the Babylonians took all of the wise people, all of the influential people, and they took them out of the Jewish people and took them to Babylon and then made them Babylonian, gave them new names, taught them the culture, because that was how you couldn't always go in and just wipe a whole nation out. So you assimilated them, you made them like you. It hasn't been done maybe very recently, but other nations have tried that. If you look at what the settlers, the colonialists did in North America with the First Nations people, the American First Nations people, the American Indians, they took their children away from them and raised them as white children to try and decimate their culture. It is a shocking, unrighteous, unjust, horrendous way to try and wipe out a nation and a culture. And please, America is not the only nation that's done it. Let us not. It has been done in many other nations in the world and kept very, very quiet. There are many histories of nations in this world that have been whitewashed, literally. But God is going to bring all of that to the surface, because those First Nations people are just as important to God as the colonialists who conquered those nations, and He is for them, just as for them. And those things are all going to start to be exposed. Watch, wait and watch. I prophesy that. God has told me that. Moving on. So that's what they would do. They would assimilate a nation into themselves in the hopes that they would be able to make a nation so their own culture that nation's culture would die out. The Greeks were actually incredibly good at that, because even the Roman culture started to be called the Greco-Roman culture. The Greeks were very good at that. As Westerners, we are very influenced still by Greek culture, very much so. And that's one of the reasons why we struggle with the Hebrew context, because the Hebrew context is circular and Greek culture and context is very linear. Okay, so, but the Jewish people could never be completely assimilated. They refused. They stuck to their own culture, they stuck to their own customs, they stuck to their own religion, even when they worshipped other gods. Their own worship, their own way of worshipping, their own feasts and festivals, they were always a remnant, always often a minority, but always a minority of Jewish people who refused to be assimilated